John has shown here in the past. He went to the Cleveland Institute of Art, did his graduate work at the University of Illinois at Champaign, and was a good friend of one of our former professors here, a guy named Tim Vermeulen. John now teaches at IUPUI in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and he shows his work at Denise Bistro in New York, in Chelsea. Had a show there in February, and his students drove from Fort Wayne in early February up to New York to his opening, which I thought was very cool. So welcome, John.
Thank you. Thanks, John. Well, thank you. I'm not sure how much I'm going to use this microphone. I'm not very comfortable using them. But I'd like to begin by thanking Bruce, especially Bruce Leap and John Baker collectively for inviting me to show this opportunity. And I'd like to thank Verily Blim as well, who I assume isn't here tonight. But Verily has been really wonderful to work with and help me get things settled. And I really have to compliment you on this building and on the gallery in particular. As John mentioned, I showed here, I think it was 14 years ago. Tim Vermeulen, who taught here, Tim and I were classmates at Illinois. We were roommates, actually. We were roommates as well. Tim lives here in Chicago, but Tim offered me a show, and it was a little room. It was literally a little carpeted room. Does anybody remember it? Remember it? Very small. I mean, it was a great place to show, but this is an enviable gallery. I really think the building itself is gorgeous, so I'm really happy for you. And the gallery, I think, is one of the nicest college galleries I've been in. I mean that in all sincerity. It's really a beautiful space, so I'm really honored to be here and to exhibit. To give you a little background, I do have some images to show of other people's work and of my own work. I went to school in the mid-'70s I graduated in 1981 from the Cleveland Institute of Art, and it's primarily known, the teachers I had were mainly abstractionists. Julian Stanzak was a teacher of mine. He was an op painter. He's still working, very well known. He was a friend of, they were all ex-Albers assistants at Yale. So it gives you an idea of what their work looked like. It was very geometric, color-oriented, obviously. And early on, I tried to be an abstractionist, and I wanted to be an abstractionist because my instructors were. But I think, you follow your own voice eventually, and I realized that my love was more in narrative work, in representational drawing, and that's pretty much where my work developed. And actually, it wasn't until I got to graduate school that my work really took off. And for those of you, is anyone thinking about graduate school? Anyone? Anybody? Nobody? Any painters here? Is anybody awake? The great thing about graduate school, if I can put a plug in that it gives you 2 years or 2.5, now some programs are 3 years. It gives you that much more time to really mature as an artist. We've sent schools, I teach at Indiana University, Purdue University, Fort Wayne, and I've been there for 20 years. And we send students on, and it's exciting to watch them move on and see their work change. And those 2 extra years, in my case at Illinois, 2.5 years, really gave me a chance to focus on what I was interested in. And the work I did in my last semester, I started doing these nocturnal scenes of imaginary and somewhat realistic places. They were landscape oriented, and it's not that dissimilar from what you're going to see in my work. So graduate school was a great opportunity just to develop, and then obviously it led into teaching, which I've really been blessed with a career as a college educator. And anybody who can tell you, it's you receive as much as you give. So it's a really wonderful career. So that's a little plug-in for anyone who's considering teaching at all. So, I mentioned I was interested in realism, and I thought, well, where do you begin? Realism, and I have some categories I'm going to cover. Realism is such a broad term, and this is kind of a textbook definition, but I love this last thing. Realism in the visual arts is a depiction of subjects as they appear in everyday life without embellishment or interpretation, which I don't know how you do that. I don't know how you represent everything without embellishing it or with the human hand. depicting or getting in the way, so to speak. This is the work of one artist I really admire, Richard Maury. He's a painter, I believe he lives in Italy, and if you think about realism, in some sense it's holding a mirror up to nature. That's that old saying that you shouldn't have any, the artist's hand really shouldn't be present. It should just be about what you're seeing. Well, Richard Maury is one of these amazing realist painters who, it goes beyond photography. People say, oh, it looks like a photograph. But Maury's work is in some ways transcendental. It's almost hyper-real. So he's somebody who I look to as being a realist painter. But again, it's a pretty broad spectrum. Jane Lund, I don't know if you're familiar with Jane. I happen to know Jane personally. She's a pastel artist who shows at Forum in New York and does these, again, hyper-realistic images, still lifes. She does figures, and these are all pastel. These are dry pastel drawings. So when you think of pastels, normally you think of something that's dusty and maybe the Impressionists, you think of Degas. But these are actually done in that traditional dry pastel medium. But she's able to get this hyper clarity using that medium, and she'll spend 8 months on these drawings. So realism in the sense of just looking at something and depicting it or trying to represent it, again, without any kind of embellishment. Wayne Thiebaud is somebody I greatly admire. Now, this is starting to, veer off. It isn't, it isn't as much of a depiction of what's holding up a mirror to nature, so to speak. But Thiebaud, the love of common objects, the influence of pop art. I mean, that's what pop art was all about: popular culture. And also the love of the medium. In his case, the love of paint, paint looking like frosting. Gotta love that. Edward Hopper. I'm very fond of, mainly because of his use of architecture and human and people in environments, and in his case, in New York City. Do most of you know this painting? Do you know where it's at?
Yes.
Very good. I've asked my students, and they don't know that, so you're lucky. Will Barnett, again, I still consider this all realism, so it's a pretty broad spectrum from Richard Maury to Will Barnett. Will Barnett is actually a friend of mine. He's been a mentor of mine for 15 to 17 years. He's getting up there in age, but he's a wonderful artist. He's taught at the Art Students League. But an amazing designer. I love how he takes the flatness of the picture plane and even the figure, and he actually eliminates detail and makes it more about a compression of space. But I still see all this within the pale of realism. Well, then there's photorealism. Photorealism, as the name implies, it was a movement in the early 70s, late 60s, early 70s, and man attempting to represent or remove themselves from the hand, the influence of the hand, and I think it was reactionary to abstract expressionism, if I'm not mistaken. So just try to represent everything they see through the camera. So whatever the camera sees is what the artist paints. No embellishment, no changes. Donetti, another famous photorealist painter of that time, obviously Chuck Close. Now, I'm not interested in that kind of realism. So if you think about realism, well, okay, maybe one thing, maybe not the other. So it's sorting out where you really fit in, because even in the pale of realist, somebody asks you, what's your work about? And you say, well, I paint realistically. Well, how realistically? And I'm trying to show you that it's a broad spectrum. Surrealism, surrealism, now we're getting a little bit closer. I've had people call me a surrealist. I don't know if I necessarily believe that or consider myself to be a surrealist. But started in France, André Breton, with influence of visual imagery from the subconscious to create art with the intention of without the intention of logical comprehensibility. Dali's persistence of memory. But what I love about surrealism is using the vernacular, using the tool, so to speak, of representational drawing. You can even call it Renaissance skills, perspective, volumetric rendering, and so on. Lighting to represent believable settings, but then obviously it can only exist within a painting's context. Magritte, you're fortunate too. Chicago has a great collection of surrealists, has a great collection of Magrittes. So a wonderful show, I think it was about 10 years ago, at the Art Institute of Magritte's work. But it's a painting like this, when you look at it, it can only exist within a painting. Now you'd say, well, you can take a photograph and do it. Well, yes, you could, but Magritte was famous for challenging the viewer's perception of what is real, what is a painting, what is reality, so to speak. One of my great heroes, though, has to be de Chirico, Giorgio de Chirico, and he fits into that classic surrealist mode. If you ask me what I like about him, I couldn't tell you. I mean, that's what I think a great artwork does. You can't really pinpoint what it is about it that touches you. It's like good poetry, or music. There's just something about it that resonates to me. However, for my interest with de Chirico, it's this sense of mystery. I love the idea that you can't answer these questions. And in some ways, unlike the earlier pieces of realism, they actually raise more questions than answer them. The mysterious, foreboding shadow, here, or the little girl, or what got out of that cage? Questions like that persist over and over again. And also certain things like time of day. De Chirico lived in Turin, in Italy. And so there's a sense of light, the palazzas, the trains in the background. Sometimes the clocks will appear, but always these elongated shadows. So this sense of nostalgia, which I'm very much attracted to as well. So this is one of my drawings. This is called The Past Returns. And it's a charcoal drawing, and it is about, I don't know what it's about. I mean, this is another thing. I'll be somewhat coy about giving you the definite meanings of some of these work, and in some cases I don't know what drew me to the image itself. And I try not to dig too deeply, but there were things that I was going through in my work, a sense of history and mystery too. I still like that sense of mystery that I love in de Chirico that I try to project in my own work. This, of course, is a charcoal drawing. I will work in charcoal and oil paint. I've resolved, I'm just going to be, a representational painter. I'm not trying to push any envelope, so to speak. I'm fairly comfortable with working within this idiom. But I do love to draw. And actually, that's what I teach primarily at the university I'm at, is drawing. I do teach painting as well. Beginning back to de Chirico, the use of statuary is another thing, as well as the use of lighting, the use of time of day. This is in the show itself too, called Above. This piece actually came about from a brooch. My wife's grandmother. So my wife's grandmother had a brooch that was passed down to us, and it had this very interesting image of an angel on it. And it's one of those things where you just look at the image and it just triggers multiple usages. Where can for me, it just one thing led to another. I've always been influenced by statuary, both growing up in the Roman Catholic Church or in cemetery statuary, things like that, reliquaries of certain kinds. So a piece like this suggests both life on earth and then life above in heaven. I mean, the star directly above, and actually the brooch had. I don't know what happened to the brooch, or I'd show you a picture of it, but it was basically like this. It was the angel, and then above it was a star. And it was just something very poetic about the sense of, the angel longing for what's above, being tethered to the planet Earth. And then in the background, the very mundane homes, and then something that's somewhat temple-like as well. So the two look upwards, but are, fixed onto the Earth itself. Any questions so far? Anybody? in terms of statuary too, I've still, you know, in keeping with de Chirico, the suit of armor. Again, I had some. This is going to be a kind of humble beginning, but I had some little plastic models of suits of armor. For a number of years, I was a still life painter. I'm not showing you any of those works. I think maybe one of the shows I had, the last show I had here at Trinity, I did a number of pieces that were based on toys I would find at flea markets. And I found that to be, and actually the Surrealists did the same thing. They would go to the Paris flea market and they'd find objects and they'd put them together. And I found that to be a really interesting way of triggering my imagination, just going to the flea market and looking and finding objects. It's sort of like getting that brooch and just having it resonate in some mysterious way, and you don't know why it resonates to your subconscious. And you know, I did these still lifes with toys, and I would set them up in various scenarios. And if you go to my website, you'll see some of those older still lifes with the toys. And I still have, I still collect things like that. But I had this wonderful suit of armor that was a plastic model. And I love the idea of putting it in and juxtaposing it, especially against something a little more gritty, a little more urban. In this case, the cityscape. And there's an interesting story about this. I showed this to a friend of mine in New York, and he got really upset about the use of this, the American flag. Which is funny. And he said, you know, when you put the flag in the painting, you're stressing American imperialism. And I thought, okay. That wasn't my intention, but and then the cross too. The cross triggers, you know, anger in people. You know, it's still very potent as an emblem and for what it represents. So, depending on who you show these things to, you know, you may not have that intention originally, but it's funny how these things trigger that kind of response. But just this duality of in and out, an interior setup, an exterior landscape, high art, quote unquote, you know, the suit of armor. Representing nobility, and then this gritty urban scape. And you know, I did spend 2.5 years in Chicago living in Hyde Park, and I've always loved, you know, this is kind of a remnant of my Chicago days, the Water Tower. I still love those things when I see them passing by. Saint in the City, and again, that's a reference to a Bruce Springsteen song. I don't know if anyone's familiar with It's Hard to Be a Saint in the City. Anyone? No? Going back to statuary, this whole idea of using things that are not people. You may say, where are the people in your paintings? Well, I'm not interested in really painting people. I have friends who are wonderful figurative artists, and in school I enjoyed painting the portrait. I enjoyed painting people, but I never liked the fact that it really locked a painting down specifically. So I guess these are a little more oily in the sense that they don't want to be nailed down. So using statuary, using sculpture, or in this case using fragments of sculpture. This painting actually is somewhat, well, I'll tell you what it's about. It's about these dreams I used to have about my father. My father died when I was going into my last year of art school. And I kept having these recurring dreams that he was alive. You know, everybody goes through loss, experience that. That, you know, the past never remains buried. Certain things in the past. So in this sense, you have the excavation. It's meant to be a hole that's dug open. You know, the lantern. Either you're burying this thing or you're digging it up. And I think with the past, you're always doing one of the two. You're always trying to bury your past, or you go back to it, you know, like a dog digging up a bone, and you're always, where did I leave that? You know, I can't live without it. And you dig it up, and then you say, oh, I really didn't want that. I'm going to go in the middle of the night and bury it. So it's about that persistence of memory, if I can borrow from Dali. Magic realism. Now, this is a term I wasn't familiar with, but a friend in New York who is a magic realist, whose work I do have examples of, turned me on to this whole idea. And actually, there were people in New York who were influenced, and some people call it American surrealism. Let me see if I have one. Yeah, John Wilde. Now, John Wilde is considered a magic realist painter. Now you may say, what's the difference between magic realism and surrealism? Well, they're very similar. Surrealism, you could say, technically is connected to the actual movement with Breton. And magic realism, I still think with magic realism, the scenes could actually happen. Maybe they're embellished a little bit, but there's still potential that things like that could actually happen. But anyways, John Wilde, and the piece that was used on the card was a tribute to John Wilde, which I'll show you in a minute. So I have a little bit of information on who he is, and Bruce asked me, who's John Wilde? Well, John Wilde was a painter, an American painter, who taught at the University of Wisconsin. And he taught drawing, and he was an excellent draftsman, and very much a classically trained artist, in the sense that he would do silver points, he would do paintings on a traditional gesso ground, he would only paint from daylight, things like that. But the work had this classical sense of the figure, of space, and of light, and of nature, natural forms. So they were beautifully drawn, and he was a wonderful draftsman. And as I started to have shows, and as I had people I, for lack of a better term, idolized, I started writing to them. I started writing to these people. And, don't be afraid to do that. Sometimes they write back. And in this case, John did. He wrote back and he said, oh, I like your work. And so it developed into a correspondence. So every time I had a show, I would send him information and he'd write back. And it really maintained itself for a number of years. So you can see from John's work, there is this strong sense of the figure, but in these very unusual environments. Wonderful draftsman. I think there are images of people he taught with at Madison. So he taught at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. And I did have the opportunity to go visit him. And actually, there's a wonderful text out, if you're interested in John's work, called Wilde World, The Art of John Wilde, that Ted Wolfe wrote. Does anybody know Ted Wolfe? He was a wonderful critic. He wrote for the Christian Science Monitor for years. But anyways, Ted Wolfe wrote this wonderful biograph on John's work. And but anyways, I wrote John, and I just thought I really want to go up and meet him. And I had a colleague at the university I teach at who studied with him. He took a drawing class, in the early 70s. And the two of us drove up, and he lived outside of Madison. And this was November 2002, so this was 7 years ago. And he was very gracious. He invited us into his studio. He looked at what I did, and he had a very small studio space. And you can see here, his paintings all around. They're not very large. They're very small paintings on panel. He did show here at Perimeter, had a number of his shows in Chicago, and then he showed at other places in New York. He was a member of the National Academy, and John died, I think, 4 years ago. So, out of respect for him and for his tutelage and for his inspiration, I did this painting. So I tried to include images that John had in his work, the bird, as you saw earlier. And actually, it was funny when I visited him. He and his wife lived in this wonderful ranch house, and right outside the dining room were windows similar to this, floor-to-ceiling windows. And he would go through, I think it was 50 pounds of corn a week and 50 pounds of some other kind of bird feed a week. So it's like 100 pounds of bird feed a week that he would scatter just outside the window. So he and his wife would sit inside. It would be like if you scattered bird seed right out here and you just sat there eating your breakfast, and birds would just flock because he loved them so much. And also this little scroll is representative of how he uses, or he did use, I should say, that kind of way of depicting words in images. So if I can go back a bit. So this is my little tribute to John Wilde, and that's who he is. So I'm really appreciative that I got to know him and I got to have some kind of connection. Because as most of you know, being an artist is a fairly isolated existence. You work in solitude. You have a show, the show goes up, the show goes down. And you hope that there's some resonance with somebody. So if you find a kindred spirit, you're lucky. So I was very fortunate. Barbara Adrian is another magic realist. She teaches in New York, teaches at the Art Students League. And actually, she's an interesting person. She's the one who first turned me on to John Wilde. And she studied with Reginald Marsh at the League and was a classmate of George Tooker and knew Paul Cadmus and Jared French, who are other people considered magic realists. So Barbara's work is like that too, where it could happen, but it takes liberties with reality. Now I don't know Andrew Wyeth, but Andrew Wyeth, doing this research, the more I look at his work, first of all, how many of you know who Andrew Wyeth is? Okay, so a lot of you don't know who Andrew Wyeth is, right? That's interesting. I do this with my own class because for a number of years, when I was in art school, Andrew Wyeth was kind of a lightning rod. People used to argue, oh, he's not an artist, he's an illustrator. Remember, did anybody remember that argument? You remember that. So we're dating ourselves. But he wasn't an artist, he was an illustrator. And then as time went by, I would ask my students who knows who Andrew Wyeth is. And gradually, hands weren't popping up, but Andrew Wyeth was a household name for a number of years. Well, anyways, he passed away this past year. And the more I look at his work, I still love it for the simplicity, obviously the technical accomplishments, but there is something strangely surreal about Wyeth's work, even Christina's World, which I don't have a slide of, but and I have seen others kind of lump them into that magic realist mode. This is one of my paintings. So if you think about magic realist, I feel comfortable with that term or that label, even though I don't know where my work fits in. But I feel some affinity for these people like John Wilde or Barbara Adrian. Any questions about this painting? I'm curious what you think of this painting. Any interpretations? Nobody? Well, I should tell you about this painting. I happen to be very fond of this painting. There are people, like my dealer in New York hates this painting. She hates it. Hates it. I've known other people, women especially, who hate it. My daughter was the model. She hates it. She hates it mainly because I cut her head off. A little bit of vanity there. But anyways, this goes back to my toy collecting days. This is actually a creature from the Black Lagoon stuffed animal, which they actually did make. And I bought one for my daughter, being a fan of that kind of ephemera. And I had this idea of her just holding clutching the creature doll. And if you can see the title, it's entitled Friend. And I became a parent late in life, and I still have these feelings that as a father, you want to be protective of who your children hang out with, who their friends are they, who they hold dear, or even what they hold dear. So a lot of it's about parental fear and control. Can anybody relate to that? A couple of you? I'm sure most of your parents could relate to that. But anyways, that's what this painting's really about. So unfortunately, I had to cut my daughter's, the personage of who she is. And there's kind of, I hate to say this, but there's kind of a Madonna-like quality too, Madonna and child. That wasn't really intentional, but it was more about this strange creature being clutched by a child and the contrast of the two. After the flood, this, a lot, and I'm gearing up for some examples from my neighborhood, but I do have images that were taken from my neighborhood and where I live and natural environments. So, these are landscape-based and they are embellished by imagination. So this is where I break the first law of the first slide I showed. Anybody? Any questions? No? Same thing with this one, passing through. This could happen. I love the idea, though, of an analogy I heard once of life, that it's like a bird passing through a window, going in one window and going out the other, just the transitory, temporal nature of life itself. just how quickly life passes. And actually, it's represented in the tomatoes. If you notice, the tomatoes go from green to red, left to right, the ripening. But it is a frozen moment under a blood-red sky. But I do love that sense of drama in the potential of that drama. Now, I put this in here. You may notice that I have this thing about symmetry, and in particular, bilateral symmetry. John, when I was hanging the show, John had some students come down, and bilateral symmetry in particular is the arrangement of opposite sides of a medium axis that only one plane can divide in essentially identical halves. So dividing something down the center, that's the kind of symmetry I'm mainly interested in. You know, a good example is Da Vinci's Vitruvian Man, or anything in nature where you see this beautiful design, God's design in nature. But I'm fascinated by symmetry, and I said this to John, mainly for the subtle drama that's created. Because when you divide something down the center, I find that, and first of all I should backtrack. When I was in art school, I had a teacher who said, and I love pronouncements like this, he said, all art is comparison. And it stuck with me, 30 years. All art is comparison. What does that mean? Well, he's got a point. First of all, you can't help but compare. It's human nature to compare, even in paintings, light against dark, big against small, near against far, things like that. So the idea of dividing something in half forces you to compare left against right. And whatever subtle differences that occur becomes high drama. So just by having, something, first of all, it's very frontal, it's very iconic, and I am, influenced by liturgical art. In this case, this beautiful Byzantine image of Christ, and I think it is the Last Judgment, because you can see the figures coming out of their tomb at the bottom. But just the subtle differences, even the hand blessing and cursing. What's that, John?
Oh, I was just noticing that the angels are on Christ's right, so that's on his right are the good and faithful.
The sheep, yeah.
Right, and the goats.
The goats are on the left. Yeah. So the whole thing of bilateral symmetry is something I'm very much drawn to. And you can see it in a piece like this. Actually, the funny thing about a drawing like this, I still may do it, but I was interested in doing a series at one point of all of the questions Jesus raises in the New Testament. And I was somewhat overwhelmed because I think there are a lot of them. I think there are a lot of questions. This is one of them. I think it's in Matthew where it says, "When the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth?" And I may come back to that someday. But that's why it's somewhat representative of a human heart. What's going on in the inside? Is it either ready for Christ's return, or is it barren and desolate, as in what's outside? This is a quote by James Yude, who's a critic, teaches at the School of the Art Institute, and I love this quote he used. This was from a catalog I had printed for my show in February, about the everyday becomes an aperture to the eternal. So I think the work you're going to see now, and the work I'm interested in, stems from just everyday life. Seeing everyday life as a miracle, seeing God in the everyday, seeing, the simplest thing is being a miracle. Even the act of vision, I think, is a miracle. Well, this takes me back to, this is not a painting, by the way. This is a picture of my daughter. My wife and I became parents late. We actually adopted my little daughter from Guatemala when she was 4 months old. And it was such a life-changing experience. This is 10 years ago. And I fortunately I had a sabbatical. I had a sabbatical at the university, and I found myself taking her on these walks around my neighborhood. And it was the strangest thing, maybe just being a father for the first time, but my eyes just seemed to open up to everything around me. Everything seemed to take on this special quality, homes, scenarios. So here she is bundled up, and I don't know if you can notice, but look at this house in the background. So the nice thing about the sabbatical was I got a lot of work done, but as I was taking her on these walks, I started noticing things that, caused that what-if scenario. I talked earlier about seeing that brooch and saying, well, what if? Well, that house, let me go back up. I don't know if you can see it. Now, this has been embellished. So this was, you may walk by it and say, what's this dopey little, craftsman-like house? But when I saw it, I thought, would it be funny if you saw a tongue horse in the window and this whole scenario of high art invading, common everyday culture, everyday life. And this one is titled Standing Still, which is in reference to the horse. But seeing the everyday and seeing the treasure that is in the everyday life, and even in your neighborhood, wherever it may be. And that's what I started to notice. Like this is a very bad photograph of a painting that's in the show, but again, the same thing. There was a woman, first of all, there's this grand home 1 block over, and a really beautiful Renaissance Revival home. It's still there. And every Halloween they'd put this cheesy little cat on the front door, which cracked me up. I love the irony of that. And I have some more of these to show you, these sketches. I keep sketchbooks, and I have ever since I was an art student. And sketchbooks not in the sense that I'm going to sit down, I'm going to draw you, or I'm going to draw that bottle. They're more idea books. So whenever I have an idea for a picture, I quickly sketch it down, and actually the cruder the better. So when I got home, you can see here, little notations of color. This is actually, you can see it's practically 10 years a month ago. But just the sense of the symmetry, the cat on the door, and I think I did, the title. The title just came to me right away, Trick or Treat, which led to this painting. So the idea of, and I hope it's not a one-liner, just setting that up for the cat on the door, but the grand house and just how incredible that home was, or still is. And then also this sense of invitation, of going up to the door, what's awaiting you. And as I mentioned earlier about painting things that are familiar with me, or familiar to me, the everyday Foursquare, I live in a Foursquare. This could be my house. It's not my house exactly, but I live in a Foursquare. I've grown sunflowers, maybe not 2 stories high, but they've been 12 feet tall. They've been pretty big. Under this wonderful summer light and color. So just taking what that's another thing. Somebody told me, I think I was going through a dry spell, and they said, well, just paint what you like. Paint what you know and paint what you like. And there's something very liberating about that. Instead of having to think, oh my goodness, I've got to come up with something greatly profound and earth-shattering. It's like, well, just be true to yourself and be honest. I'm going to go through these pretty quick.
Would you say something about you repeat imagery of concentric rings?
Yeah.
Do you have anything to say about that?
I don't know where that's coming from. This one you can sort of see the beginning of that, and then in the piece with the burial scene with the statues, there's again that sense of concentric rings. In a piece that's coming up, it obviously has to do with radiation. You'll see the moon used a lot in my work too. The moon, the sun sometimes, but mainly the moon. But I also like the sense of representing sound. At times it can represent a resonance of something that emanates from one point and then or originates at one point and then emanates or resonates outwardly towards the outer rings. And maybe it's just a return to pure geometry. So I'm not sure myself exactly where that comes from. And actually, I mentioned earlier about teachers I had who were abstract painters. The more I look at my work now, it's starting to become a little bit more abstract as I get older. But they're still pretty much based on things I see around me. This piece, you talked about the emanation or the rings. It's a formal device in the sense of having something gradate and diminished towards the edges of the picture plane. But I like the sense that in this case from the moon, it implies light. It can also imply sound, as in this case, the Cardinal's Song, if you think of the title. So it's doing double duty. The Cardinal is supposedly singing, and it represents the song that originates from him and radiates outwards. Now, most of my paintings begin as drawings, either as sketches or in some cases as more finished charcoal drawings. I don't have any of the tandem pieces in this exhibition, and some of these are yet to become paintings. Like this is fairly recent. This was done for my last show, and I'm tempted to turn this one into a painting, which I think I still might. I like this idea quite a bit. This one, I'm currently working on as a painting. So I've gone back to this idea of doing the drawing first and then doing a partner painting to have it in tandem, both in black and white and in color. And did anybody notice the bird up here? This is at the church I attend in Fort Wayne. This is there. If you went there, you'd see this. But I saw it, and it struck me as funny. There's a little opening in the bird, and I thought it was very innocent. And animals, too, have become more important in my work. You'll still see the same use of architecture and symmetry, but animals have become more and more of a focal point. I don't know why. I don't know. They're not wildlife paintings per se, but they are. I moved beyond the representation of the human figure. There's more of a sense of people and they're the effects of people. And somebody may say, well, they're not animal statues, are they? Well, no, they're real animals. Now, here's a little pop quiz for you. The glean, does this remind anybody of a particular work of art?
The Corvée. No.
Yeah, the Gleaners. So that's another thing. A lot of times I'll see works or get ideas that are quotations of other people's work. So this idea of the glean, it's not gleaners, it's just glean, but the idea of the rabbits definitely had an influence from Millet's masterpiece, The Gleaners. Now, just briefly, I want to say a few things about sketch to painting, how the works evolve. As I said, I'll have an idea, and I keep the ideas in these sketchbooks, and I jot it down, and usually I try not to stray too far from the initial sketch. There's an energy about even the crudely drawn sketch, and in my case, the more crudely drawn, the better. I like the fact that it's quickly done, there's no detail, and then it allows me to take it and expound upon it. So in this case, that little sketch turned into a color drawing that had a little bit more information given to it, and then into something even more detailed. So when you see pieces like this, usually it's a tip of the iceberg, and I think for most artists' work it is, that you'll see the finished piece, but you have no idea what went into the making of it. I know an artist who does hundreds of preparatory drawings to get to the finished painting, and you just don't see how much work went into the making of it. So this eventually turned into this painting, Awake. This is another scan from my sketchbooks, one of my sketchbooks. It's just one page, and you can see a couple of these these two have not been turned into paintings. They may, and that's the other thing I like about keeping sketchbooks, because, or in this case, idea books, because the ideas can sit there on the back burner, and sometimes it'll be years, 1 year, 2 years before I actually execute a picture or a painting. And I like that. It's kind of sat there, it's been in my subconscious, and if the idea is strong enough, it just won't let you go. In my case, this is how it works for me. It won't let you go. It'll just grab you by the cuffs and say, you've got to do something with this image. And it's that kind of compulsion and obsession that I find compelling because in some cases I'll spend 2 to 4 months on a painting. So the idea has to really be that driven. But anyways, if you look down here, this little postage stamp size sketch, I just had the idea, you can kind of see it, and actually I enlarged it. And I already had the title, which was just Gate. And I love the simplicity of just the parallel walls, the central triangle. And again, just thinking in formal terms, but it ended up as, boom, as this image. So from something very crude, from something very general, it develops into something very specific. Same thing is true with this piece. Again, another scan. Neither of these have been turned into pictures, and they may never. Hopefully when I retire from teaching. That's when we get our work done, right, John? When we retire. But here, let me enlarge that.
John, you draw in church?
Yeah, actually I did. I am paying attention. I got the same grief from somebody else recently. No, when it hits, right? You can't avoid it. But this was, I think, a year or two ago. Now, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Tenebrae Vespers, but Tenebrae is Latin for darkness, and these are normally on Good Friday. So at Good Friday, I belong to Lutheran Church, Missouri Synod in Fort Wayne, and it's a very old church. It's over 150 years old, and very beautiful Gothic interior. And the Tenebrae service is so moving because, if you're not familiar with it, they go through the reading of the Passion of Christ, and then they begin to extinguish lights. They turn them off gradually, until you end up in total darkness. And the funny story was, first of all, this is a sketch I had actually on the bulletin itself. One year we went and we were sitting in the balcony, and as they were extinguishing the lights, what do you think happened in an old Gothic church? The bats came out. So my daughter loved that. My daughter I think she was 3 or 4 years old at the time, and we were sitting in the balcony, and it was just, you couldn't miss it. It was hilarious. They were just flying around, which I guess they do every night. So the idea of, this was their habitat. This is where they live. But this piece, getting back to the concentric rings, the emanation of light, and this is to me, a very abstract piece. Just the radiation, the symmetry, the bats. I couldn't resist giving them little personalities. They do have little faces on them too. But also I want to say a few words about the drawing technique. I don't have any slides of Seurat's drawings, but George Seurat, his drawings in particular, I think are some of the most wonderful works on paper ever done. They're so beautiful. I mean, I love his paintings, don't get me wrong. But I don't paint this way, but the drawings do have a pointillist look to them with the use of the tooth of the paper and the charcoal and the interaction of the two. So there's no blending, there's no overworking. They don't take that much time to do once the idea is there. But I do love that optical mixing of gray, where you have black and white particles coming together as you do in Seurat's drawings. And then finally, I've been fortunate enough to have been showing at Denise Bibro in New York. A colleague of mine, Audrey Ushenko, showed there and shows there, and I would go in for shows, and I found that in my case, most of my opportunities to exhibit have been through networking, just knowing people. Like here in Chicago, I showed at Wood Street, which was in existence for a number of years. It's since closed, but Tim Vermeulen showed there, and Tim showed Mary O'Shaughnessy, the owner, my work, and Mary liked my work, and I have 2 shows there. So sometimes it just happens. I haven't known that many people who just sent their slides in, and the people just absolutely dropped what they were doing and called up the artist and said, I got to show you, I have to show you. Usually it's more personal than that. Usually it's a personal contact. And actually with Denise, I wasn't seeking her out. We actually went to a Yankees game once, and it was the Yankees playing the Indians. I'm from Cleveland, so I had to take a lot of ribbing from a Yankees fan. Yeah.
Evil empire.
It is the evil empire. It is. It shows you what money can do, right? Yeah, the best team money can buy. But anyways, Denise has been very, supportive of what I've done and what I do. I've had 5 shows at her gallery. She's in Chelsea. I don't know if you're familiar with Chelsea or New York, the infamous Hotel Chelsea. But Chelsea, here's the Village, and where's Soho? Here's East Village. But Chelsea is between 8th and 10th or 11th Avenue in the 20s. So Denise is on West 20th between 10th and 11th. So it's this area here. It's where a lot of galleries moved to in about 10 years ago. Soho was very popular in the 70s and 80s. And then the property values just went sky high. And then a lot of galleries just moved. And Chelsea doesn't have the allure of Soho. The buildings are big warehouses, but it serves its purpose for a gallery. And so these are some shots from my last show, and you can kind of get a sense of scale. Big spaces, high ceilings, somewhat industrial looking, and as I said, or as John said, I should say, as John said in the introduction, I was very happy that a number of my students were excited to come into the show, and they came in on of their own accord. The university did not pay for their travel, and they just carpooled. They just all got together and said, "Let's get in and go to the opening." And in the middle of February, they just hopped in a car, several cars, and came. So I was very happy, and that's one of the benefits of teaching. I'm very fortunate to have this opportunity to teach and to be with students, and as anybody can tell you, it's a wonderful career, a wonderful profession, and I don't know if I'll ever we'll see how the economy goes. The show was accepted well, but with the economy being what it is, it'd be nice to have another show, but we'll see what happens. And here's a lot of happy, smiling people. This guy, by the way, Jason Stopa, he was one of our students. He's at Pratt in Brooklyn. So, they do go on, and they do, develop careers of their own. So you can become very proud of your students. And that's it. Are there any questions? Nobody?
Luke, that's your cue. We told Luke he had to ask the first question.
I guess he's speechless. Well, if you don't have any questions, you can certainly ask me. Are we going to go into the gallery? You can ask me in the gallery. But again, thank you for this opportunity. I really appreciate it.
John, thank you.